not accept this book are those who have not thoroughly examined how we got it, how it's put together, and what's in it. In fact, I've had so many people look at me and say, how can you believe that thing with all the contradictions in it? I love it when they say that. I always say, name one. And then they get a bit more, yes, Lord. Oh. And it's, they'll say, well, they're all through there. And I'll say, well, then it should be easy for you. Find one. And they never do come back with one. But there are all sorts of myths. And like I've said before this week, there are a lot of things we know that aren't true. And that's one of them. The Bible is riddled with myths and contradictions. It's only in there if you say it's in there. Let's take a look at this as closely as we would take a look at anything else. You see, this isn't a matter of what we choose to believe. This is a matter of what is. We can all the time stand around and be relativistic like a lot of the world is and say, well, whatever you want, whatever you believe is true for you. If you're falling out of an airplane and you say, well, I believe I'll land softly. That's not true for you. There are certain limiting circumstances called velocity, and terminal velocity, actually, and therefore you're not going to get past that. And whenever it comes to the Bible, I believe what C.S. Lewis said, and that is that nobody ever really breaks the commandments. What you do is you go up against them and break yourself. We go up against this truth in Scripture, if it is true, and let's take a good look at it while we do this. Some will say, by the way, that Christianity is one of only many roads to heaven. I had a professor that loved to draw a wagon wheel. I guess it's because that's what he could draw. And in the hub, he would say, that is God, that is heaven. And all of these roads lead to heaven. You need to change the battery? Oh, I'll just keep talking. I won't even mention it here. There you go. Ignore the man behind the curtain.
It's just your imagination.
It's just your imagination. You really should have taken your medication before you came to school. And you wouldn't see these little men keep coming up to the front. I'm going to baptize the next one to walk up. It doesn't matter. I'll do it again. Even on the golf course, see, here's a water hazard. What to hinder you? We go right. And on this wagon wheel, you thought I'd lost my place. He will write Christianity, but he'd also write Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Islam and the like. And said they all are roads leading to God. Well, if that is true, that would be jolly nice to know about. But there's a big difference between Christianity and all of these scriptures. All of these other scriptures out there. Number one, Christians examine their scriptures. They check them not only to see what they say, which other religions check their scriptures to see what they say, but Christianity examines their scriptures to see whether they are true. When was the last time that you heard any seminar in the, let's say, Buddhist evidences or Islam evidences? The answer is you've never heard it. They don't do symposiums to check the veracity of their scriptures. They don't look to history, to archaeology, to sociology, to linguistics. They don't look to any of this to see if what their scriptures say is true, even about the character of their scriptures. You see, Christians have no trouble investigating this. And I find it amazing that we are called the narrow-minded ones. Whenever we read more thoroughly and are more open to examination than any other group I know of, we will say, bring it on, examine it, dig it up, try to find something. And here's the deal. If you can find a way to prove to me that the scriptures are false and riddled with myth, then I'm out of Christianity. I'll leave it, because even though I love my Christian life, if I only have a time-limited amount of time to have my joy, and there is no heaven, I plan to go ahead and find some. Therefore, I want to know, is the Bible true or not? How did we get this thing? Is this text reliable? We've all heard people say something about this by basically comparing it to one of those little games you play when you're a kid, and you all sit around in a circle, and one whispers something to one ear, then they're supposed to repeat it to the next ear, and when it comes out the other end, it's completely different. Now, fair enough, most of the time it was changed on purpose to make it silly. But the point is still a valid point. How do you know you've got the Bible that they actually wrote? It's a very good question, because we don't want to examine a false copy. We don't want to examine something which is completely riddled with operator error, shall we say. where each person that was putting it in put in a different thing just because they got a bit clumsy or careless. And over a few thousand years, that can make a major difference. And so, how do we know? Well, if you know the culture of the people who wrote the Bible, you know. For you see, the copies that we have of the Bible are meticulous copies. They are copied with such precision that when a scroll was hand copied all the way, one letter at a time, if one mistake was made, the entire scroll was destroyed. It didn't stand. You didn't put an addenda out into the side or an errata. Instead, you threw the whole scroll away. Now, this is not true, I hasten to add, for copies that were made, let's say, from the 800s on AD, because those people did sometimes erase and redo. But we're talking about the first copies. We're talking about the first ones who came to us, and the ones that we still have, by the way. They were so meticulously done that each copy had to be made on a brand new writing surface. It had to be prepared in a specific way. And we're talking mainly here about Old Testament scriptures. That papyrus, the paper, the surface, whatever it was, had to be made in a certain way so it would be clean, error-free, no stray marks on it, and then you'd begin to write. And then it really got complicated. Each copy had to be made in a row of columns. Each column was 30 letters wide. Now, it doesn't matter where the word break is. You would quit in the middle of that word and start on the other. The 30 letters wide was a strict, hard rule. And by the way, that's why sometimes it's fun to read this stuff. It's because you've got to find out which one of these is a word break and which one of these is not. They also didn't use punctuation. They didn't have it in their language, plus it was considered a strange, stray mark. They didn't use it. They didn't put spaces between the words. It had to be absolutely uniform. And that was a way to make sure everything stayed the same and it wasn't changed. The ink used was specified. It had to be prepared in a certain way. You couldn't just use anything. And each copy, this is very important, each copy had to be made from an authenticated original. In other words, that circle we talked about, where the kids whispered into each ear, is not the right illustration. It would be as if the first person went to each person in turn and told them. You couldn't make a copy from a copy from a copy. That was against their culture. You had to make a copy from the original. And again, most people don't know that, but that is not hard to find out. It's amazing to me. I'll talk to people and I'll say, why don't you look into this? And sometimes they'll break down and say, well, I don't like to read. All right, fair enough. If you want to stamp a stamp on your head saying ignorant and easily led, go ahead. But the fact is, why would one have to relearn all of this when it's already been done? And you can go find it. It's a bit of a struggle, but if your eternal security rests on it, it's probably worth a run by the library. Talk to them. As we go through, even the tiniest letter could not be written by memory. Now, what this means is, now we have to use English for this, so to use as an illustration. If the word "thee" is up there, you don't look up and see "thee" and then copy "thee." You had to look and see the T and copy that, the H and copy that, the E and copy that. No letter could be written by memory. That's fairly serious. It is also a good way to make sure your copy is good. But it goes on. That's not enough for them. No letter could connect with or overlap another letter. If you did, the scroll was tossed. The distance between each letter was in fact measured by a thread or a hair, whatever was available. That's not why, someone asked me once, is that why monks had that bald bit? No. But it's a lovely thought. It is, isn't it? Every letter of every page of every book was counted and compared against the original. In other words, after you were done, you weren't done. The guy that knew how many, and we're doing this in English again, how many O's are in there, would count the O's in the script and make sure that they were enough. Exactly right. And the L's and the T's. They would have, now they didn't do it 26 times. Not everybody checked every letter, but it was enough to make sure the integrity of the script was absolutely perfect. And then, how about the New Testament? Oh, it was even more closely scrutinized than that. Because you see, the New Testament was written during the lifetimes of the people who lived through it. And they could also write. And they did write. In fact, they wrote so much to each other that if every New Testament on the face of the planet were to disappear right now, we could reconstruct it immediately from the letters the first century Christians wrote to each other, because they quoted the Scripture that much. Every single bit of it is in first and second century Christians' letters to each other. Now, with that much writing going on to each other, had someone written something in the New Testament which was untrue, which Jesus did not say, and Pilate did not do, they would have brought it up. Myths, of course, spring up all the time. There's a new book out, which may be a little difficult for you to get here because its target area is Asia. In fact, in India, it's caused a real uproar, written by a Sikh. And Sikhs will tell you that their religion is entirely that of peace and respect, and yet this is about the life of the fellow that founded the Sikh religion, and it has a whole chapter on Christianity and how Jesus was an illegitimate child that Mary threw in a stable because she wanted to dispose of him, and he was only kept alive because of the heat of the sheep and goats in there. And I'm reading that thinking, and your evidence would be, where are your witnesses? Where are the witnesses for the New Testament? They lived during the writing of the New Testament, and they wrote to each other extensively. And yet, even Roman examiners who came to check out what this Christianity was could not find lies and faults with it. Did not. And even though they did not accept the Christianity as their religion, would say they seemed to be harmless and good to each other, and left it alone. The New Testament, in other words, was scrutinized by the people who lived it. I have found something out. I like military history. And I don't get into a lot of discussions of it because I'm not an expert in it, but I really enjoy it. And I was sitting with a group once as we went through Gettysburg and just found it fascinating. And afterwards, a couple of these are really Civil War guys. And they got into the longest discussion over what kind of buttons this uniform had and how many were actually on this hill versus was it really on that hill, and went on and on and on. And I thought that I had seen the pickiest people on the planet until I ran into a discussion between some people that had been in World War II. And they were having a real hard discussion over, all right, which one of these really happened? They were both in it. Now my point here is, if you write something which isn't true about World War II, you will get letters. You will get phone calls. It will be all over you. Because people are still alive that went through it. The New Testament was written when people that were still alive and gone through it were alive. And guess what? They couldn't go against it and didn't go against it. That's very important. Now, by the way, those people who dismiss Scripture are some of the most biased people on the planet. And here's the proof of it. We can look at other surviving works to see how validated they are. For example, in college I had to read Caesar's Gallic Wars. I don't know why. I think it was punishment, because it didn't seem to improve my life any. It's rather like Iliad and Odyssey. Two of the most boring books ever written. Could have done with a good car chase or two, but it wasn't done. Caesar's Gallic Wars. Ask any teacher, Caesar's Gallic Wars, is that an authentic ancient text? And they'll say, absolutely. Well, it was written sometime between 100 and 44 BC. But our earliest copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars is from 1000 AD, a gap of 1100 years. Well, how about Plato? Did Plato really write the tetralogies? And everybody will tell you, absolutely, he did. Not a question about it. When did he write them? Between 437 and, maybe 387 BC? All right, when's our earliest copy? 900 AD. 1,200-year gap. Absolutely. By the way, if you're wondering, I believe that Caesar's Gallic Wars and Plato's book are fine ancient text. I'm not questioning them, but there's another point being made. It will be made in a bit. We will wave the point flag when it happens. Aristotle, did he really live? Oh, of course he did. Did he do his works? Yes, he did. Those were written down. 384 to 322 BC, no question. Our oldest copy comes from 1100 AD. A gap here of about 1400 years. And yet none of them are questioned. They are presented as authentic books. In contrast, within the last 15 years, we have found fragments of the book of John that date from the year 90 AD. 90.
AD, which is interesting because some people used to say John wasn't written until 200 AD, and now they have some explaining to do. 90 AD, which means we have a gap of just about 25 years after the first writings. And yet they question the integrity of Scripture. That's bias. And they'll find in Scripture, with all of this backup, that it will say this king fought this battle and this is what happened. And then they will dig up one rock that says, hi, I'm the king and this is what happened. And they'll say, see, the Bible's wrong. Wait a minute. Isn't that bias to trust one rock versus all of the evidence on the other side? And yet, the bias is real. We also measure the reliability of a text by doing something else with it, and that is to check the copies against each other, and also to check the number of ancient copies we have. For example, if you only have 2 copies of a letter and they differ, it's going to be really hard to tell which one was the original. But if you've got 500 copies of the letter and a couple differ, you know which ones are wrong because you can see the weight of the evidence. So how many copies do we have? Let's go back to this. Caesar's Gallic Wars is the number 2 best attested ancient book. It has 10 copies available to us. That may not sound like a lot, but to an ancient person, that's really pretty impressive. 10 copies. Well, how about Plato's Tetralogies? We have 7. Aristotle's works, 5. The Bible, over 24,000. Number 1 is 24,000. Number 2 is 10. Not exactly Monday Night Football, is it? Some of the Super Bowls I've watched in my life look a little bit like that, but that's probably a painful thing to bring up. And then when we check the lines against each other to say, all right, in all of our copies, how many of these differ? Even when